That a statue of the Virgin Mary could move on its own is something that you might find hard to believe. In the same way, I would not have believed it until I witnessed it with my own eyes on a chilly morning inside the humble church that I attend here in the countryside of France. And if you'll give me permission, I'll explain to you in detail how everything started. The only priest in the Montreble parish for virtually the entirety of my life, my name is Jacques Limont, and I am 72 years old. I have served in this capacity for the majority of my life. Located in the midst of hills and vineyards that have been around for centuries, this hamlet is a location where time seems to move more slowly. It is not about me, however, in this story. The story is about her, the woman who came into my life at a time when I believed that God had abandoned me. In order to come to terms with what took place, it is necessary to visualize the atmosphere, the lack of sound, and the anguish that penetrated those stone walls. The church in Montreble is like an elderly lady. She is charming in her own way, but she is reserved and has been marked by the passage of time. It was constructed out of gray stone in the 17th century, and its stained glass windows are uncomplicated but brimming with allure. Not only does the dark wooden altar still carry the imprint of the hands that sculpted it, but there was also a figure of the Virgin Mary that stood or rather rested in a niche high up, just above the Eucharistic table. It was a piece that had been imported from Spain at the end of the 10th century, and was centuries old. It was composed of hefty plaster. From that vantage point she kept a watchful eye on us with her soft eyes, which in recent years I have noticed appeared to be filled with melancholy. To answer your question, yes, I am saddened since the reality is that nearly no one attended Mass anymore. On days when things were going well I saw 3 or 4 people I knew. When things were going poorly I rejoiced by myself. The organ had stopped playing, the bells were ringing for no one, and my voice could be heard reverberating beneath the vaults. I had the impression that this was the case. I made a concerted effort to hold on to my beliefs. On the other hand, I must confess that there were times when I found myself staring at the ceiling of the sacristy, wondering to myself, Lord, why am I still here? What if I were to talk to the wall? My health was not as good as it had been in the past. As I approached the stairs leading to the altar, I had pain in my right knee. It appeared to be a patchwork quilt because my cassock, which was worn at the elbows, had been patched so many times that it had become worn. Despite this, I continued on because I had committed to doing so. Before she passed away, my mother Marie Claire, a woman who was both straightforward and profound, grasped my hand and told me, Jacques, you should never stop serving, even if there is no one in the pews. One day, somebody will actually listen to you. I clung to those words like they were a relic, but time is a cruel judge of hopes that are too modest. And during that winter I was on the verge of giving up. What followed was his appearance. A child who is sitting by themselves on the very last pew, in the exact same spot every time. He was probably between the ages of 8 and 9, with dark hair and dark eyes, and he was slender. He never made a sound when he arrived, and he always departed when he left. I attempted to speak with him, but he never responded to my calls. Not once did he smile. However, he was present every Sunday, remaining silent and attentive. Initially, I was under the impression that he was the grandchild of one of the villagers. However, no one in the hamlet was familiar with him. Beyond the confines of the chapel, no one had ever seen him. To all appearances, he was confined to the confines of those walls. On Sundays, I felt as though something within me was coming to life. I started attending Mass with a greater sense of sincerity. When I was able to speak again, my heart, which had been heavy, began to beat with a little bit of delight. On the other hand, I was unaware that this was merely the preparatory work for something that would completely transform everything. Not only do I mean everything, but I also mean every square inch of that chilly chapel as well as my exhausted soul. The child was present for the 3rd Sunday in a row that I had seen them. Same time, same seat, and the same lack of noise. Because his footsteps were so light, I hardly saw him as he entered the room. His tattered coat hung loosely over his shoulders, which were weak. Upon closer inspection, his woolen scarf appeared to have been made by hand. In every instance, he arrived by himself, gazing at the altar with a level of solemnity that I had never witnessed in a child. And when I got closer, he bowed his head when I approached. It has been a very long time since I became a priest. All kinds of people have come through my eyes, ardent believers inquiring unbelievers and lost visitors. However, there was something distinctive about this young man, a subtle presence that altered the entire mood. It appeared as though he was carrying a burden that was excessively heavy for a body of his size. It was snowing outdoors on that particular Sunday. Floating white flakes were cast by the light that came from the stained glass windows. It was almost time for the start of the Mass, but I just couldn't bring myself to begin the ceremony. I approached him with extreme caution. Without uttering a single word, I sat down on the bench that was directly in front of him and waited. After waiting for a gesture, a glance, or a sigh, I finally heard it. I had been waiting for it. Not a voice, but a muffled sound, as if someone had been protecting their tears for an excessive amount of time. While I was turning slowly, I noticed that tears were silently flowing down his face. He didn't utter a single sound, he didn't shake, and he merely sobbed out, as if he were someone who had been accustomed to experiencing pain. I made an attempt to speak. "Honey, are you feeling okay?" On the other hand, he did nothing except glance up at me, as if he wanted to convey everything all at once, without using any words. It was the very first time that I experienced something peculiar and unexplainable. It was as though time had stopped. At precisely that time, the bells of the church started to ring on their own, and the statue of the Virgin Mary, which was located in the uppermost part of the building and was lighted by a sudden ray of sunlight that penetrated through the stained glass window, appeared to be looking straight at him. There was a frown on my face. There were clouds in the sky. Does anyone know where this light possibly be coming from? The Mass went on as usual. The gospel was proclaimed by me, and my voice was breaking. It appeared as though each phrase was a blade that sliced through the air, and it landed gently on the youngster. He paid attention to everything that was being said while keeping his gaze fixed on the altar. Now that the final blessing had been bestowed upon him, he got up and grinned for the very first time. A teeny-tiny smile so agonizing that it was genuine. Following that, he exited the building through the side door and vanished into the snowfall. I came running to the entrance. I took a look around. None of it. I inquired with a few of the neighbors. Nobody knew who he was. "In the hamlet, we do not have children that are like that, Father," they added. At that moment, something occurred to me on the inside. There was more to this than just a child, it was a calling. The statue of the Virgin Mary was the destination of my visit that evening. I got down on my knees and said, "If this child is the answer, then point me in the right direction. If it is a request, please give me strength." What I did not know was that the request would come sooner than I had anticipated, and that the Virgin would not merely direct me, but would also come down from her pedestal with her own hands. My inability to sleep continued throughout the night, even after the youngster had vanished into the snow. I was sitting in my wicker chair by the fireplace, which was freezing, and I was holding an antique rosary that had been with my mother for many years. As I moved my fingers between them, the worn beads spun slowly. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees in the square, and the moon, which was far away and pale, shed a chilly light on the stained glass window of the sacristy. It was impossible for me to stop thinking about the image of the Virgin Mary. I received the impression that she was still alive that morning, despite the fact that she had been carved more than a century ago while her hands were extended forth. My body shivered as I thought about the way the light shone on her, the way the child looked at her, and the way the child gazed at her. It seemed to me as if someone was attempting to convey something to me, and it was like a whisper in my head. It was then that the words of my mother came back to me, and it was as if a wave of silence was breaking inside of me. Over the course of 40 years, she had been absent. Despite this, I was able to make out her words that night. "Jacques, you should never give up on your people, even if they don't come, even if it seems like it's a waste of time. At some point in the future, my son, someone will hear, and when they do, you will not be surprised." I lay her to rest with my own hands at the cemetery of the nearby town, surrounded by cypress trees. I was 28 years old at the time. When I was younger, I was a young guy who was full of faith and ideals. I believed that I had the ability to rekindle the hearts of an entire generation during that time. However, the passage of time is more destructive than water is to stone. The years of discouragement arrived, with empty masses and baptisms that were not performed. How many times did I congratulate myself by myself? What was the number of instances that I questioned whether or not my presence made a difference? I was brought back to life, injured, and healed all at the same moment by that child, whose eyes were filled with agony and mystery, and whose grin was so small that it was just beginning to fade away. Not only did I not know who he was or where he had come from, but I also knew on some level the reason he had come. The following morning, I made a decision that was straightforward yet significant. Reciting the Hail Mary out loud and placing fresh flowers at the base of the statue of the Virgin Mary was something I did for the first time in many years before. I was on the phone when I got a call that made my blood run cold that very same day. An ill woman who had left the church more than 20 years ago asked me to come to her house and pray for her. I agreed to do so immediately. I spoke with the young man who attended your mass, Father Jacques. He stopped by my place. I stayed mute while he reached out and knocked on my window. He did not make any statements. I was in a state of rapid heartbeat as he simply pointed to the church and then went. What exactly was going on? This young man was who? It was a race to the church. I went down in front of the statue of the Virgin Mary and asked the same question once more. Mother, is he your brother? In that moment there was total silence. However, I started to have the feeling that this week was unlike any other week that I had experienced before. It was becoming clear that something was developing, something that would soon take place and not only alter my religion but also the faith of everyone in Montreble. I really couldn't have imagined that everything would happen so quickly, because it really did take place the following Sunday. For me, the concept of Epiphany has always held a special significance. A reminder that God shows himself to the smallest of people, to those who come from a great distance, and to those whom no one anticipates was brought to my attention when I celebrated the manifestation of Christ to the 3 wise men. But throughout that year at Montreble, he was going to make himself known to each and every one of us in a way that was so obvious and unmistakable that it was impossible to ignore. Over the course of the previous week, snow had accumulated on the margins of the walkway, and it had turned into ice by the time the morning arrived. There was a sense of ceremony in each step that I took as I made my way slowly toward the chapel. There was a difference, something that was imperceptible yet palpable, despite the fact that the air inside was frigid. I took great care in preparing the altar, arranging the candles, and placing the incense in the censer, all while being aware that no one else in the hamlet was concerned about it anymore. However, at 7:20 in the morning the front door opened, and there he was, the youngster. He had an identical coat and eyes, but there was a noticeable difference between them. On this occasion, he did not take a seat at the rear. He sat down in the 3rd row, which was closer to the altar, and he did not take his gaze off the statue of the Virgin Mary for even a single second. The Breton couple, Madame Elise with her cane, and elderly Jean, who could hardly hear but insisted on attending every January 6th, were among the other familiar faces that appeared gradually. Altogether there were 12 of us. It occurred to me that the number of apostles might be a coincidence, but it could also be that it was not. As I started the Mass, my spirit was overwhelmed with uneasiness. Nevertheless, as I read the Gospel, the words that hit me like a bolt of lightning were as follows. Entering the house, they found the child with Mary, his mother, and bowing down, they worshipped him. Matthew 2 verse 11. I took my time reading this verse. My gaze then turned to the statue of the Virgin Mary, and after that, it was directed on the infant. The way he was kneeling, with his head lowered and his hands clasped, gave the impression that he was surrendering his entire being with everything he had. A strong gust of wind entered the vehicle through the side windows at that precise moment. It was not a strong or forceful wind, but it came out of nowhere, and along with it came a piercing sound, a thud, as if something extremely heavy had fallen. All of the individuals turned at the same time. My heart came to a stop. It had been more than a century since the statue of the Virgin Mary had been placed in its niche, which was more than 2 meters high. The statue was now lying on the ground. Even though it had fallen, it was completely undamaged. There was not a single crack, not a single chip, and not a single candle that had been knocked over. However, the statue had not crashed. It had fallen to the ground. In that very spot, lying on its side, it appeared as though it had been placed there by unseen hands. In the church there was complete silence. While some people gazed at one another with horror, others did so with tears in their eyes. However, the child did not do much more than stand up, walk over to the statue, kneel down in front of it, and make the sign of the cross. In an effort to continue the Mass, I attempted to say something, but I was unable to do so. My hands were shaking, my voice was breaking, and for the very first time in all those years, I found myself unable to articulate my thoughts in front of the altar. The events that had just taken place were not a coincidence. There was nothing that could have adequately prepared me for what was to come, even though it was a call, a miracle, and a gesture from heaven. I looked back at the boy, but he was no longer there when I did so. He had vanished, as if he had never been there in the first place. Standing there, I was confronted by the monument that had fallen and an even more profound vacancy. There was no trace of the youngster. There was a terrible hush that engulfed the entire cathedral. It was the kind of silence that screams from within, the kind that occurs when reason is unable to describe what the eyes have just seen. As my heart continued to beat rapidly, I approached the statue of the Virgin Mary with a steady and deliberate pace. Even though there was no draught, the candle flame still flickered ever so slightly. My hands were respectfully placed on the sculpture. It was frigid and weighty, yet it was still whole. It was inconceivable that it would have escaped with not even a single scratch after having been dropped from a height of more than 2 meters. However, there she was, complete, with her arms extended out in front of her, as if she had just come down of her own volition. Her eyes were turned upward, as if she were still staring at the sky. Mrs. Elise, a devout member of the congregation, approached, shaking physically from head to toe. "Dad, it was actually... Wasn't it a sign that it was a sign?" But I was unable to respond. I simply gave her hand, which was wrinkled, a strong squeeze. Everyone started kneeling down. While others wept profusely, others prayed in private. A man whom I had never seen before came in, removed his hat in a courteous manner, knelt down, and started reciting the rosary without uttering a single word. It was as if he was aware of the situation, as if he had been summoned. At that same moment, the celebration was no longer under my control, despite the fact that I had returned the Eucharist to its place in the tabernacle. The Virgin Mary was the one who was in charge of directing the dance. After making my way back to the sacristy, I shut the door behind me. As if I were a child, I sat down on the wooden bench and started crying. This is not due to fear or emotion. As soon as I realized that I was no longer by myself, I burst into tears. Over the course of many years, I had attended Mass in front of empty pews, under the impression that heaven was silent. Heaven, however, had responded inside that gentle fall, within that muted sound, and within that statue that was still standing. Later on, I made an effort to come up with a logical answer. I scaled the altar and inspected the niche from a higher vantage point. It was a sturdy foundation. Nothing was broken, and there was no damage to anything. The region had not experienced any earthquakes thus far. There were no animals present. In addition, the stained glass window that was adjacent to it did not even open because there was no wind. The statue had fallen for no other reason than the fact that it had desired to do so. There was just no other explanation. The Holy Virgin Mary desired to descend to earth. Her desire was to sink her fingers into the floor of our humble chapel. By lying down at our feet, she sought to convey the message. I am here. Even now, I am keeping a watchful eye on you. What about the child? I went back to the village and asked questions in the homes, bakeries, and shops there. I described what he looked like. No one knew him. No one had seen him. It was as if he had never existed. However, I knew. I knew what I had seen and what I had felt. From that day on, nothing would ever be the same in Montreble. The days that followed seemed to come from another era. One that only lives on in the memories of the oldest residents. The church in Montreble, once abandoned, began to breathe again. The confessional, which had creaked with loneliness, now saw discreet lines of people returning, broken but full of hope. The candles burned continuously. Flowers multiplied on the steps of the altar, and the statue of the Virgin Mary, still on its temporary altar, seemed brighter, even though it was made of the same aged plaster as before. I began to notice something even more impressive. It wasn't just faith that was returning, it was the bonds, the ties that time, pain, and indifference had broken. Young people who had never set foot in a church began to come with their grandparents. Couples who barely spoke to each other began to pray the rosary together. Even old enemies in the village greeted each other with a discreet but sincere gesture. All this without anyone preaching anything, without a single word about conversion, sin or confession being spoken from the pulpit. It was her presence that did the work. Silent, firm, maternal. I hardly felt like a servant, an instrument to open doors and clean the pews. The rest came from heaven. When I approached the woman, she stood up, removed her hat, and said, "I'm sorry, Father, my son wanted to come and pray. He has cancer. He said he dreamed of a lady who promised to take care of him. He said she was the mother of light. So we came." I remember one particular morning when I arrived early to light the candles and found something that caused me to kneel down and cry. On the first pew, a child of approximately 7 years old was sleeping with a thin blanket draped over his shoulders. Next to him, a woman who appeared to be humble was holding a rosary in silence while her eyes were fixed on the statue of the Virgin Mary. My response was not verbal in nature. The only thing I did was kneel down next to them and pray. It was exactly like that. Day after day, folks came in with a great deal of suffering and a fragile hope, and they departed with a more determined look on their faces. It was not because a miracle had taken place that could be seen, but rather because an inner miracle was taking place. I started writing down my thoughts in a notepad. I made a note of names, dates, and profiles. To not write a book, but to ensure that I would not forget it. Due to the fact that I was aware at some point that all of this was being done in preparation for something more significant. And it was during one of those afternoons, when the church was filled with stillness and people were crying, that I finally received the answer that I had been looking for as long as I could remember. The stairs were climbed with difficulty by an elderly woman whom I had never seen before. She cried out to me in a feeble voice, "Will you allow me to show you something, Father Jacques?" It was an old photograph that she was holding in her hands right then, and there, on the image that had become blurry, was the youth. She was the same youngster who had been seen during Mass, and she was also the same child who had vanished when the statue had fallen. In addition, she stated, "Despite the fact that this is my grandson, he has been gone for 2 years." The photograph shook violently in the woman's hands as she held it. There was the young child depicted in the photograph, smiling sheepishly next to a small dog and a bicycle that had seen better days. In addition to having the same deep eyes and facial characteristics, he also had the same soft and serious demeanor. Without a shadow of a doubt, it was him. Taking my time, I made my way to the front row bench and sat down. The woman sat down next to me, her eyes absorbed in the portrait of the Virgin Mary of the Sacred Heart. I repeated the name Adrian in a low voice, as if I were doing so in order to invoke the name of an angel. His name was Adrian, my father. Although he was just 9 years old at the time, he was struck by a car while he was walking home from school. After that, I shut my eyes. My throat became swollen with a lump. Her next statement was as follows. During the final months of his life, the only thing he talked about was returning to church. He stated that he was missing Mass and that he had dreams about a stunning woman whom he referred to as his little soldier of faith. I turned to her, unable to suppress my emotion. "Do you think he came here?" She nodded slowly, her eyes filled with tears. "Father, I have no doubt about it, since on the day when the statue fell, I felt my heart being dragged here. When I awoke, I felt a pain in my chest, and the first thing that came to my mind was, go to the church, he's there. My grandson, or his memory, or perhaps his soul, I can't explain it, but I know he had a mission," she replied with a stern voice while looking at me in a gentle manner. There, at that very moment, I understood something that I had been trying to rationalize for days. Adrian was not a visitor. He was the bearer of the promise, the Virgin's little instrument, sent in a mysterious way to awaken sleeping hearts. I remained silent, a silence filled with reverence. I had been trying to rationalize this for days. Then I remembered my own promise, the one I had made to my mother so many years ago. Never stop serving Jacques. One day someone will hear you. And when that happens, you'll know. Now I knew that day had come. The boy had heard, and he hadn't just heard. He had answered. The Virgin did not fall. Rather, she descended. She descended to the level of the people, to the level of the ground, to touch the dust with her own feet and say, "I am here with you." He had brought back those who had left. He had brought tears to the eyes of the skeptics. He had brought those who had never kneeled down to their knees. And yet, the Virgin did not fall. My purpose was renamed thankfulness from that day forward, and it has persisted ever since. As a result, I no longer experience feelings of isolation while sitting in the pews, quiet while at the altar, or a lack of warmth in my faith. It was possible to keep the commitment. We will celebrate the Feast of Our Lady of Lourdes on Sunday, February 11th. One that is significant, one that is Marian, and one that I believe was chosen by the Mother herself. Even before 7 o'clock in the morning, the small church in Montreble was all packed. A large number of individuals, including entire families, young people carrying backpacks, old people using wheelchairs, people from nearby villages, people from faraway cities, and people from locations that we were unaware even existed, had heard about us. While others arrived with tears in their eyes, some arrived in complete stillness. Those who were still present carried rosaries, photographs, messages, and photographs of loved ones. It was almost as if they had been summoned by something. In addition, I was aware of the name of the person who called me, Mary. The figure of the Virgin Mary was placed in the middle of the altar, encircled by white flowers and olive branches. It was concealed in a niche, and although it appeared to be far away, it was situated in close proximity and was easily accessible. On the other hand, the photograph of Adrian was displayed on a tiny wooden stand next to her. He was a child like so many others, but he was marked by something that even death could not erase. His sweet smile and his earnest eyes conveyed his innocence. My heart was hammering as I made my way up to the altar pillar. A woman who wanted to clothe the priest of the miracle had presented me with the brand new cassock on the occasion of the miracle. However, I was aware on a profound level that the miracle was not mine. I started the Mass with a confident tone in my voice. I talked of Mary's presence among the common people, her humility at Cana, her stillness at the foot of the cross, and her consolation at Lourdes. There I mention all of these things. Lastly, we arrived to Montreble. During the moment of consecration, I requested that everyone remain silent and said, "Let us offer this moment to the one who came down from the altar to remind us that heaven is closer than we think." I then raised the host, and at the very moment that I said, "This is my body," a child in the front pew yelled out, "Mom, it's the boy. Look, he's here." Turning around, everyone did so. I looked in the direction that the young boy was pointing, despite the fact that the mother was attempting to calm the child down. There, in the side aisle, I caught a glimpse of him for a brief moment. The same smile and coat, Adrian, are both present. In a tender manner, he looked at me. Following that, he turned around, made his way toward the entrance, and vanished, just as he had done the first time. When I saw him, I wasn't the only one who did. I was told the same thing by 5 different people later on. The same scene was described by each of them. Before that, none of them had communicated with one another in any way. The fact that a young woman named Claire, who had been unable to conceive for a number of years, found herself on her knees after receiving communion was even more remarkable. Her body was shaking and she was crying. She shared her experience at the subsequent Mass, stating that she had experienced the sensation of a child's hand taking hers, and that she had heard the words, "You are going to be a mother." A few months later, she received the news that she was expecting a child. The real miracle was not the fall of the statue, but the fact that the people got back up. Adrian never returned, at least not physically. But from time to time, someone tells me about a dream, an intuition, or hears light footsteps during prayer. And I smile because I know he is here. In the child who comes back to pray, in the father who returns home, in the old lady who has learned to smile again. Today, the Church of Montreble is alive, and I, an old priest who had almost lost hope, remember every day the promise I made to my mother. Someone heard and he answered, "If you ever pass through Montreble, come in and sit down. Breathe deeply. Perhaps you will hear a whisper. Perhaps you will feel a little hand on your shoulder. Perhaps a soft glow near the altar. And then you will understand what I have understood. The Virgin Mary continues to descend every day where she is most needed, in silence, in love, and in the faith of little ones."